Bom dia a todo mundo. Muito bem-vindos ao webinar sobre as novidades do Maya 2016. Gostaria de dar boas-vindas a todos que se registraram. Hoje a gente tem um convidado muito especial dos Estados Unidos, meu colega Steve Roselle. Steve Roselle é um especialista técnico focado em Maya, tem uma bagagem incrível dentro do software Maya, já trabalhou em diversas produtoras, ele vai falar um pouco a respeito. E eu gostaria de dizer para vocês que depois desse webinar, que vai ser todo feito em inglês, a gente vai fazer também outros webinars em português, falando também do Maya e também do 3D Studio Max no dia 16 de julho. Gostaria de que vocês também acompanhassem esses nossos webinars que estão por vir. Uma mensagem que eu gostaria de falar para vocês antes da gente começar a nossa sessão técnica, nossa sessão com o Steve Roselle sobre o Maya, sobre as novas formas de licenciamento que a Autodesk está propondo agora, de aluguel. Agora a gente consegue alugar um software sobre demanda, se você precisa alugar o Max ou o Maya num projeto por 3 meses, ou você quer alugar ele por 1 ano, e agora isso é possível, isso está mudando dentro da empresa. A partir do ano que vem, o Max e o Maya só vai estar disponível para aluguel. A suíte a gente ainda vai manter para compra perpétua também, tá ok? Gostaria de também convidar vocês para o AU Brasil, que vai ser no dia 3 de setembro de 2015. A gente vai ter 5 palestras de mídia e entretenimento, teremos convidados internacionais. Vai ser um evento muito bacana, que vai ser realizado no World Trade Center aqui em São Paulo. Teremos, além de convidados de fora, como eu falei, a gente vai ter também convidados especiais do nosso mercado brasileiro também. Vocês terão desconto especial por participar desse webinar e vocês vão receber depois algum e-mail, algum promo code para vocês possam fazer a inscrição com desconto. Agora, sem mais delongas, vou apresentar a vocês o Steven Roselle, que ele vai começar. Steven, I would like to appreciate your visit to Brazil, your presence here in the webinar. I hope everybody enjoy your webinar, and here's the mic.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Hello, everybody. My name is Steven Roselle. I'm a senior technical specialist at Autodesk. I live in Austin, Texas, and work primarily in the United States and Canada. I'm lucky enough this week to be in Sao Paulo, Brazil, to talk about Maya 2016, and that's what we're going to do today with the webinar, is run through all the various features and updates in the latest release. So if you do have questions, we will be monitoring, I believe Rodrigo has mentioned this, but we will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, type them in, and Rodrigo is going to kind of help me manage that part of it. So moving on to the topic at hand, Maya 2016 is a very large release. It's one of the, I've been working with Maya since its inception, since the very beginning, probably starting in 1998 or so. So I have a long history with Maya, and I think this is probably if not the biggest, one of the biggest releases that I've seen in that long span. And really, we've been able to do something for everybody in this release. We've added features in lots of different areas. So in the past, where we would focus on one particular area, like maybe animation or rigging, now we're actually focusing on all of the different disciplines, and you'll see that as I present the various features. So what you see here is a list of kind of the core feature sets in Maya, and this is actually organizationally how I'm going to present the webinar, but this is also a representation of how we develop Maya. We have dedicated product product management and product design teams that work in these 5 kind of key areas. Foundation is kind of the core of Maya. It includes things like the UI, file referencing, the API, the programming interface. And then, of course, we have things modeling, animation, lighting and rendering, and then visual effects, things like Bifrost. So we're going to talk a little bit about everything today. And I'm going to start with the foundation. And again, the foundation encompasses kind of the core of Maya. In a lot of different ways, actually. And we've done a number of things in this release related to the foundation. starting with the user interface. So the user interface with Maya 2016 has been completely overhauled. That includes just the look and feel of the UI. It's more modern, it's more streamlined, easier on the eye, but it also includes things like high-resolution display support. So if you're working with a 4K monitor, it scales really nicely now. It also includes a reorganization of menus and shelves. And it's really kind of easier to show this when you see a before and after. So this is what the Maya interface looked like in Maya 2015 and before. And as you can see, it's nice, but it's also very cluttered, and the contrast is very stark. If you move forward a frame, what you'll see is it's a much cleaner, nicer looking UI, an easier color palette, a neutral color palette. Again, comparing the two, it's very easy to see the difference. So not only has the look and feel improved, but we've also improved the ability to scale the user interface. So what you see here is actually a different resolution of the same interface. And we've added controls that allow you to set the scaling of the interface dependent on the device, or rather the display you're using. So what we can do here is basically set, for instance, the resolution of the icons and the menus independently of whatever your resolution is. So another key area of improvement on the foundation is the Hotkey Editor. So the Hotkey Editor has been completely overhauled. It had been somewhat neglected over the years. And in this release, we've basically re-architected it. We've also changed the interface. So what you see here is a visual representation of hotkeys. And then if you hold Shift or Control or Alt, this visual representation will update with the key that you set to show you which keys have been applied or which keys have been set for that modifier. So you'll see this is Shift. You'll see that this is Control. And then if you hover over any one of the keys, it will actually give you a visual feedback of what that key has been associated with. So from a visual standpoint, it's much easier to create hotkeys and assign hotkeys. But we've also improved the architecture of hotkeys, so the ability to search for commands for hotkeys, the ability to quickly update without having to save and reload Maya, and also things like sets and contexts. So you can actually create unique hotkeys for different parts of Maya. For instance, G can be one hotkey in the viewport, and it can be a different hotkey in something like the Hypershade or the graph editor. Another piece of the foundation is viewport. The viewport 2.0, with every release, we improve it, not only adding just base functionality, but adding what I call bells and whistles, are nice rendering techniques as well. One of the cool things that we've done here is we've added something called, the first one you see here, background texture loading, which is one of my favorite new features. It's very simple, but it's very useful. It allows you to load scenes very quickly without having to load all of the textures, which you can see here in the image. So you can see the scene is loaded and interactive before all of the environment textures open. That allows you to work with very, very large scenes and begin to interact really quickly without having to wait. And I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but this is kind of a broad list of all of the things that we've done. So that sums up everything that was done on the foundation. Moving on, oh, actually I take that back, one more thing. This I put under foundation as well because this has to do with the import and export of files. So we've added a number of new features that allow you to bring data into and send data out of Maya in different ways. One is called a game exporter, which you see here on the right. This allows you to control the export properties of the objects that you want to save out of Maya. And we've added some nice animation features that allow you to essentially define sequences of animation and save those into things like takes. So you can have a linear sequence of animation in Maya, and then you can define those ranges and then have that save into an FBX file, and then something like Unity or Unreal can ingest that and basically use that in order to create animation blends or whatnot. We've also added cloud import-export. So we've added the export to Unity and Unreal, but also cloud import-export for things like Autodesk 360, which is our cloud-based system, as well as things like Dropbox, where you can save directly to Dropbox or open directly from a Dropbox account, as well as things like 123D, which involve things like the Catch application for photogrammetry, as well as things like character generator for building characters, and you can load those directly into Maya now. So that wraps up Foundation, and I promise soon we're going to get into the actual demonstration, but before that, I want to just go over quickly the updates to modeling. Modeling has gotten a lot of improvement, has seen a lot of improvement in this release, and I'm going to show it interactively here. But first, I just want to run through what we've actually done. So the first thing to talk about is the completion of the modeling toolkit integration. In 2014, we acquired a plugin called NEX, N-E-X, which had been around for many years, and it was a very powerful plugin. But rather than just putting it in Maya and moving on, we took a 3-year process and we began to integrate all the features from NEX into what we call the modeling toolkit. In this release, we finished that integration. And you see a list here of the things that we've completed in this release. I'll show some examples of this when we get into the demonstration. But we've done a lot more than that. We've also added additional functionality for doing things like partial symmetry modeling. We've changed the pivot editing workflow in Maya. We've added new UI for streamlining modeling operations and a number of other things as well, including improvements to things like the bevel tool, the multi-cut tool, and so on. Another thing we've continued to integrate is Open Subdiv modeling. This Open Subdiv is something that was written but at Pixar, and we've basically taken that and put it into Maya and then continued to evolve that over time. In this release, it is now multi-threaded. We also added adaptivity so that it will tessellate dynamically or independently depending on the distance from the camera as well as the detail of the geometry. We've added UV tiling support as well as Alembic support so that you can save crease data in Alembic and load that back into Maya, into Open Subdiv objects. And then finally, on the modeling front, we've incorporated a new sculpting toolset, which is based on the Mudbox brush engine. We've actually ported the Mudbox brush tools into Maya. So all of the brushes from a sculpting standpoint that you had in Mudbox are now in Maya directly. And I'll show some examples of this, but what it means is that we've inherited a lot of the existing Mudbox functionality. For instance, the ability to freeze objects, mirroring, steady stroke. If you've ever used Mudbox, all of this will be familiar. If you haven't, I'll show it in the demonstration. But because sculpting is now in Maya, what that means is that all of the things that you would do from a sculpting standpoint also translate to all of the standard things that Maya supports. For instance, the ability to sculpt across multiple objects, the ability to work with instances and smooth meshes, the ability to work with blend shapes. All the stuff that you would want to do in Maya proper, now you can do directly in Maya without having to leave Maya and then come back. So with all of that said, let's go into Maya and actually show some of this in action. So of course you can see right off the bat that the user interface has been improved, but what we're going to do now is focus on modeling. So let me bring a scene up and we'll start with just a sculpting demonstration. Now there's probably going to be a bit of lag because of the web sharing that we're using, but hopefully you'll be able to get an idea of how the sculpting has been integrated. So what you see here is a character, and this is actually a pretty high-resolution character. This is about around 1 million polygons. As you can see, it's pretty dense. So we can access sculpting in one of two ways. We have sculpting shelf, which basically has a visual representation of all the various brushes. This actually matches the same brush layout that we have in Mudbox. Another way that we can access sculpting is by simply selecting our object and using our Shift right mouse button to bring up marking menus and activating the Sculpt tool directly from here. If we activate Sculpt tool from here, that will essentially, under the hood, convert this into a sculptable mesh and brings me into a context-sensitive menu set that allows me to go in and turn on the wireframe, turn on things like mirroring, turn on various parameters. If I go into the actual options, what you can see is that if you've ever used Mudbox, the options for the tools are exactly the same. So if we expand some of these, you can see that the fall off with the ramps as well as the stamp settings are exactly the same as what you see in Mudbox. So it truly is a one-to-one in terms of the behavior and the interaction with the brushes. So at any rate, let's go in and actually make some changes. So if I right-click on my model, I can actually go in and set my parameters. If I shift right-click, I can switch between my brushes. So let's just go into a standard sculpt brush. And for starters, I'll just go in and start to sculpt along the jawline of my character. Now you can see that's obviously very intense. So I use my M and my B keys to change the intensity of the brush with M, or the radius of the brush, the size of the brush with B, much like all the other sculpt tools in Maya, and that will change the behavior. You can see it's only affecting one side of my character. Again, if I right click, I can go into mirroring. I can say I want to mirror that across the other side, and now I'll see that mirrored over to the other side. If I hold the shift key, much like all of the other sculpt tools in Maya or painting tools, it start to blend or start to smooth that object. So showing some other brushes, again, shift right click will allow me to switch between my brushes, or I can just go up to the tool shelf here if you prefer to work in kind of a visual icon manner. But I prefer to work with my marking menus because it's faster. I'm going to go into my flatten brush, and we'll go up to the forehead, and what the flatten brush will do is it will actually take that area that we're brushing and it will flatten it out to a plane. Now what you can see is I've created a nice little flat area there for the forehead. And then from there I might want to go in and push and pull some verts to create maybe a horn. So I'll go into the pull tool, or rather the grab tool, and what the grab tool will do is it will basically allow me to pick a point and then essentially pull that out from the center of the brush. So let me scale down my radius a little bit, start to pull that out, and you can see I'm pulling that out in kind of a linear fashion. What I can do is also turn on some interesting options here, such as silhouette, or in this case, follow. The follow will actually allow me to grab a section, pull that out, and then add some curvature to that. You can see I've broken or elongated some triangles there. If I just hold shift, I can actually smooth that out, and I can get these really interesting type of effects. Let me actually undo that. I'll scale my brush up a little bit, and we'll do that one more time and get a little bit bigger horn. So something like that. Now you can see if I come around to the side and hold shift, I can kind of start to smooth that out, and very quickly get these really interesting shapes. So it's something that wasn't really supported in Maya, something you couldn't really do in Maya before. So I don't have time to show everything, but I want to show a couple of additional things. One thing we've added as well is the ability to freeze certain objects. So we have a freeze brush, and the freeze brush will allow you to do exactly that. Freeze is basically the ability to lock parts of your geometry. So wherever you see blue, it means that area of the geometry will be frozen. If you hold Control, that you can inverse the brush, and of course I might want to get a smaller brush to get a little bit closer area there. But I'm basically kind of adding a little barrier there around the pectoral muscles so that I can start to work on those independently of the torso. So now I can come in and grab something like, say, the Bulge Brush, scale up my radius a little bit, and start to bulge those out. That's a little bit much. Let's actually bring the intensity down. I can start to bulge out the pecs, and what you can see is it's only affecting the pectoral muscle. It's not affecting anything that has been masked out. So if I come in here and I try to paint anything in this area, it's not going to affect that. I can exaggerate that, and you can see it there on the side with the stuck muscles as well. But get the basic idea. Some other nice things that we added are things like the follow brush. So for instance, if I were to go in and add something like a sculpt and add a really small width here, you can see here if I paint, it's going to kind of jitter with my brush stroke. So just like Mudbox, we have the ability to go in and add a steady stroke. That will allow me to create a fall off, essentially, basically a target and then a distance, and then that allows me to create this nice smooth curve so I can get these very, very precise patterns as I'm sculpting. So I could easily spend another 30 minutes just talking about sculpting, but there's plenty more to talk about. So for time's sake, let's move on. So the other thing that I want to talk about is lower level kind of base modeling. Some people call it Subdiv modeling or component modeling. So let's open up a file here, and we'll do some edits to a piece of geometry. So give this a second to load. Again, I have a little bit of a lag because of the screen sharing, so we'll give that a little update on your end. So what you see here is a kind of a satellite spaceship. And if I pull in, you can see this is actually made up of a bunch of parts and pieces. And if I wanted to start to refine these, I might want to grab a particular piece and hit F to frame in on that. And what you can see is I'm getting a little bit of lag because of all of the other things going on in my scene. So we added a number of new hotkeys that allow you to control the visibility of objects in your scene. One is simple H, which will basically allow you to toggle on and off the visibility of a given object. The other is the opposite of that. Control 1 will allow you to toggle visibility of that object, rather all of the other objects instead of the object you're selecting. Then I could go in here and I could do something like grab, say, a face path, and then if I do that again, now I can isolate select just the face path, and again that's with a simple hotkey. So let's actually grab this object here. I'll isolate select that object with my hotkey, and now let's begin to manipulate the components of this object. So one thing you'll notice is if I hover over my object, I will pre-highlight the component, the underlying components, which is not new. But one thing that's new is the ability to change the criteria for the pre-highlight. So if we go to the modeling toolkit, which is over here, we have a number of different settings that we can choose. Under multi-component, we can choose the type of component we highlight, but we can also go in and we can set selection constraints, which give me a list of criteria for determining what gets highlighted and what doesn't. This has now been integrated directly into the marking menus. So we have two interfaces for modeling in Maya. We have the modeling toolkit on the right, which I consider an interface for the novice or intermediate user. It's an interface of consolidated features that are easy to find and easy to use for people who do some modeling but maybe aren't modeling every day. If you're modeling every day, then you're more likely to use the marking menu system. The marking menu system is what I consider kind of the power user interface. So if I shift right click on object, then I get all of the context sensitive menus related to modeling for that particular type of object or component. So we've taken the time to fully integrate all of the modeling toolkit, formerly NEX, tools directly into the marking menus now. So for instance, if I wanted to access the same selection or transform constraints, I can simply go into my marking menus and I have all the constraints right here at my fingertips. So they stay in the context of where I'm modeling without having to leave this interface. So now I can go in and I can turn on something like shell selection, and now when I hover over my object, instead of highlighting the individual faces, now it highlights the individual shells or the sub-objects within my main object. Now I can click to select that and I can start to move that around independently. So I'll talk more about selection constraints in a bit, but next thing I want to talk about is the new pivot editing workflow. The new pivot editing workflow in Maya allows you to quickly and easily go in and access the pivot and align it with different parts of your geometry. For instance, if I go in and click on that point, it will align it to the vertices. If I hold Control and click on a face, it will orient with a given face, or for instance with, say for instance, an edge. I can orient with the edge, and now you can see the manipulator will line up exactly with that edge. While I'm working with my pivots, I can right click and I can do things like pinning the pivots, resetting the various values of the pivots, and so on. So I'll just pin the pivot, and what that will do is it will put the pivot in a position and orientation that is now relative to the shape of the object. Now when I begin to move this, it's going to move along the kind of the inherent axis of the object based on those different snaps that I did. So this includes things like scaling and rotation. So if I pull this up here and begin to scale this now and then go in and grab something like a face path, whoops, I still have my selection constraints on. Let's actually go in and turn that off. Or here's an example of where I could use different selection constraints. I can switch to border selection constraints. And now whenever I highlight over my object, it will only highlight areas on the border. And that's true here or here. It works with faces or vertices. Now I can go in and remember my previous pivot settings. I can pull that down, maybe scale this out. Again, the scale and the rotation work relative to that same pivot. So you get the basic idea. We've also added quick ways of going in and working with things like edge loops. So for instance, if I turn off my selection constraints and grab an edge loop by double-clicking on a given edge, as I move this around, you can see that's moving relative to the pivot, and it's changing the shape of the object. If I hold down my middle mouse key and Control in middle mouse, then I can push that along its own normal. So instead of moving along the axis, it's moving now along its own normal. So I could add a bulge or I could add a taper. And then in addition to that, we added something called selection constraints. Let's actually pull this down and I'll show on a different area of the object. If we grab this edge loop here, and we start to move this, you can see as I move that, it changes the shape of the object. If I turn on selection constraints, or rather transform constraints, and put us into edge slide mode. Now when I move that, the edges are going to constrain to the existing shape of the object without deforming the overall shape. You can notice that the UVs are actually stretching. That's a simple fix. I can basically go to my marking menus and I can turn on preserve UVs. And now as I begin to slide this edge, it's going to not only preserve the shape, but it's also going to preserve the underlying UVs. This works as well with things like rotation and scale. So if I were to go in and start to rotate with the same slide value, you can see that as I rotate, or as I scale, I'm going to maintain that same sliding effect. So for time's sake, I want to show, move on, but I want to show one other quick thing, and that is the ability to work with symmetrical objects. So if I frame in on this area here, what you'll see is I have a handle for this hatch, which basically opens up to the interior of the satellite. I'll hit Control-1, isolate, select that, and we'll go into my components, and you can see as I hover over my components, it highlights the component below my cursor. If I go into my symmetry options and I turn on symmetry, and we'll just set this to world symmetry for now, you can see that it will highlight both sides of my object. So this allows me to make really nice symmetrical edits. For instance, if I needed to make kind of an extrusion here, I'd apply that extrusion on both sides, and actually I have to turn off auto load there. Let's just reapply that. There we go. I had ISO select to auto load only faces selected, which I didn't really want. So let's apply extrude now. And what you'll see, as soon as I pop the extrude or apply the extrude, I get manipulators that allow me to go in and control the effect of the extrude, but I also get a pop-up window. This is called an IVE, an In-View Editor. This is new in Maya 2016, and it allows you to go in and make changes to the underlying node by dragging virtual sliders on these attributes, or by going in and actually keying values as well. So if I have an offset, I can interactively change that, or I can say I want to get this, say for instance, exactly to 0.5, and I can key that in. Now the nice thing about this is I can take the same value and I copy these attributes so that if I wanted to apply the same effect to this edge loop here, I can go in, I can apply the extrude, and then I can go in and I can paste those attributes, and I'll get the exact same effect on my extrude. You'll notice I'm working with symmetry at the same time. So let's move on and we'll talk about asymmetry as well. So right now I'm working in kind of a symmetrical fashion. But let's say, for instance, I were to go in and break that symmetry. So I'm going to turn off my symmetrical options here. And I'm going to select an edge loop here, 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 and here. And now I'll go in and apply a simple extrude. I'll add a little bit of thickness to that. I'll add a little bit of an offset to add a taper. What you can see is by doing that, I've actually broken the symmetry. So now I have asymmetry in my object. Maya can still understand the other areas that are symmetrical. So if I quit out of that and I go back in and turn on my symmetry, what you can see is if I hover over these new group areas where the finger's supposed to go, it recognizes that those are unique, but if I go to the underlying area that's still symmetrical, it recognizes that these areas are still symmetrical. So this would allow to, say for instance, make an edit on one side, apply something like an extrude, and have that mirror to the other side, even though, again, certain parts of my geometry are asymmetrical. So we've made a lot of improvements to modeling. I don't have time to go over everything because there's just too much to talk about. One other thing I'd like to point out, though, is that we have also updated bonus tools. If you're not familiar with bonus tools is an add-on to Maya that we release with every main release. So it's a 2016 version of bonus tools. And we have a lot of new features in here as well. So from editing to creation to modification of objects, as well as modeling. So one of the cool things that we've done with bonus tools is that we've integrated the bonus tools directly into my interface now. So instead of having to go to the bonus tools menu, now if I, for instance, go into face mode with my marking menus, you can see here that at the very bottom I have a bonus tools menu. So all of the face related bonus tools or the edge related bonus tools will get added to this context sensitive menu. So this allows me to access bonus tools much more easily. So for instance, if I wanted to do something like an extrude faces and preserve UVs, which is not in Maya by default, it is in bonus tools. So now we can access it directly from the regular Maya modeling workflow. So for time's sake, let's move on and we'll talk about some other topics. So I mentioned modeling, and we talked about lower level kind of component type modeling. We also talked about higher level sculpting. But another thing that's incorporated into modeling is UV editing. UV editing has seen a big improvement in Maya 2016, and we think of it as kind of a different flow, but technically it's part of the modeling tool set. So let's go into Maya, and we'll show a couple of examples of UV editing. So let's bring up a new file here. It's actually just a different copy of the same file, but before I made all of the edits. We'll give that a second to load. And what you'll see here is if I select this mesh, this kind of core piece of my satellite, and I look in the UV editor, I've got some UV shells that have already been created. And if I turn on the shell shading, what you can see is I have a simple planar projection going all the way through my object, from the front all the way to the back, which may or may not be what I want, but I might want to actually separate these out. So one thing I can do in Maya now, you'll notice, is pre-selection highlighting, as well as things like face selection, path selection, shell selection is all the same now in the UV editor. So we've made a big effort to consolidate the functionality between the 3D viewport and the UV interface. So let me just turn off Symmetry for a second. But you can see now if I double click on a face, that allows me to grab an entire shell. And then if I use my arrows, I can push that to a different tile. And then I can also go in and do things like partial face path selection. So I can grab a face here, shift select a face there, and it will highlight all faces in between. Same thing with edges. I can double click on an edge, it will select the edge loop. All the basic things that have been missing from the UV editor from a user interface standpoint have been added, or may have been added. So another thing that we've done is we've added the ability to pin certain UVs, which works with various different operations. So for instance, if I were to take both of these shells and I were to unfold these without the pack operation, so this is using Unfold 3D, which was introduced in Maya 2015. But if I were to apply this, what you'll notice, actually I have to select first, what you'll notice is that it unfolds them, but it unfolds them in kind of an unexpected way. So it does a nice job of doing unfold, but it rotates them at kind of odd angles. So what I can do is control the unfold as well as lots of other tools from a UV editing standpoint by using freezing or pinning. Similar to what I showed with geometry earlier, if I were to go in and grab some edges, say for instance in this shell, say these three edges, and there are polygons here, if I were to set those to pin, or if I were to go in and use a brush, you can do the same thing. So for instance, I have a freeze brush, which works on the UV or the edge level, where I can go in and I can pin these particular areas. What that will do is it will lock them in place so that now, say for instance, I grab this shell and I move that around, you can see as I move that, the other UVs are staying in place. Likewise here, if I move this, the other UVs are staying in place. What that allows me to do is do things like an unfold and maintain symmetry in my object. So it gives you inherent control over the symmetry of your object, but it can also be used in other ways, for instance, while you're using your brushes. So brushes are new to the UV editor in Maya 2016. So let's actually take these. I'm going to unpin everything, and I'm going to take these and I'm going to kind of push them down a little bit and maybe scale them. I'm just going to do this kind of quickly and interactively. I'll take this and I'll begin to scale it down. And what I want to do is start to change the way that these are actually laid out. And just for performance, I'm going to actually isolate this because with the screen capture, all the texture detail is slowing me down. So let's take a look at these shells now, and we'll start to make some changes. So these were basically projected from a planar map and then unfolded really simply. But in some cases, I might want to actually go in and cut these into pieces. So let's take this shell, for example. I can technically go in and grab an edge loop, and then I can go in and I could say I want to cut that. And what that will do is it will break it into individual shells. Now I double click on a face, it will isolate that individual shell, which I could use somewhere else. Sometimes you want to do this more interactively. So I'm going to undo that step, and instead I'm going to use one of the new brushes. So we'll start with the cut brush. So instead of select and apply, I can now go in and I can just interactively drag over certain edges. And as I begin to drag over these edges, I can start to cut them into various pieces, essentially. So what I've already actually cut out one, it looks like. But now what I've done is I've broken these into several different pieces. So say, for instance, if I double click on this shell now, you can see now that's a separate piece. So rather than selecting and then applying the cut, you can just interactively go in and draw on your object in order to make these various cuts. So now what I could do is say I want to reconnect these to another area. So let's say, for instance, I grab these edges here and these edges here, and now I want to go in and stitch those together. I'll just use a quick move and set, and that will connect them to my other gel. But you can see because of the original layout, it no longer looks correct, because the unfold that happened with this shell looks different with the unfold that happened with this shell. So rather than re-unfolding this entire shell, what I now do is I can go into the interactive unfold brush. And the interactive unfold brush will allow me to quickly go in and just paint specific areas that I want to unfold. You can see I'm getting kind of interesting results there by only painting the areas that I care about. So it's no longer affecting this area down here. It used to be that I would have to basically unfold everything at the same time. We also have a smooth brush that would basically do kind of a relax, essentially, of that given area. And you can see now I can start to go in and relax certain areas after I do the unfold. And then in addition to that, we've added some nice brushes for doing things like grabbing. So I have a grab brush where I can go in and I can interactively push and pull areas around. I also have something called a smear brush where I can start to smear my UVs in a given direction. So the way it would normally work is you work relative to a texture, but you'd have to see that in a 3D view. So I've kind of messed this shell up. Let's move it out of the way. And we'll take a look at this shell, which is still in its original shape. And let's kind of position that vertically, and let's look at this in the 3D viewport. So what I have here, if I actually take a look, is I've got my texture associated with the shell on my object. So sometimes it can be very difficult to go back and forth between what you're doing in 2D and what you're actually seeing in 3D. Let's turn the lights off so we can see that texture a little bit better. So what you can see here is I've got a line in my texture that I might want to align with an edge loop I have on my object. So one option would be to come in here and actually use something like the grab brush and start to push and pull the UVs around. And what I'm doing now is I'm moving the UVs in 2D and then I'm watching the update in 3D. It can be a little tricky because you're actually kind of going backwards. You're working in reverse. So what we added is the ability to work in 3D. If I undo a few steps here, I'll get back to where I was. Under my modeling menu set, we have a couple of new UV tools, one of which is the 3D grab tool. What this does is it reverses the operation. It basically gives you a brush in 3D that corresponds to the UVs in 2D. So now I can come in and I can start to paint directly on my object and in turn see the results of that in my 2D window. So for instance, if I wanted to align this area of my texture with that edge loop, I can just simply go in here and I can start to push and pull my texture around. And if you watch over here in 2D, it's actually updating the UVs as I begin to manipulate the image relative to my mesh. So I can very quickly, easily go in there and make these changes in a much more practical way. So there's a lot more to talk about. We don't have time to talk about everything, but I do want to show one other cool thing that is new to 2016. So I'm bringing back my other objects, and this is a new UV editing tool as well. So we have a new tool under UV called Contour Stretch. And what Contour Stretch does is it allows you to basically flatten out certain areas of your object and wrap textures around them. So for instance, like a road or a ribbon or something like that. And then in addition to that, for bonus tools, we've added a wrapper around that called Auto Unwrap UVs, which works with a lot of different tools. It's basic unfolding, but it also uses the Contour Stretch to allow you to unwrap things like pipes and tubes. So for instance, if we come in here and take a look at the inside of this object, we'll just hide this. You can see there are lots of parts and pieces on the interior of this, and in some cases I've had these pipes. If I isolate select that, what you can see is these pipes basically allow you to, or rather, if I were to create these pipes with NURBS objects, it would allow me to inherit the UVs from the NURB object. But if I create these directly from polygons, it doesn't have any UVs. What I want to do is create these very quickly, and I want to basically have them laid out so that I can wrap, for instance, a decal or something like that around them. Using this tool, I simply set it to pipe mode, and then I enter the tool, and that will give me heads-up displays which guide me through the process. All I have to do is choose a specific edge loop that I want the border to extend, add loop, say continue, and it will automatically unfold that and unwrap that so that I can now basically wrap a decal around it. We also have a relax option. If I click relax, it will relax all of the interior UVs. In order to really see this, you see the checker pattern now, but if I actually turn on the hardware shader checker pattern, it has a UV index that I can actually use as a visual reference for how this should look. So for instance, I can actually come in here and I can grab that, and you can see it's actually oriented kind of to the opposite direction that I want to do. So I can start to flip this around, rotate this around, something like this, scale this out, and actually I got that backwards. Let's flip this one more time. And now you can kind of see what's going on here. If you take a look at the indexing or the lettering, I have a nice even distribution of this texture that wraps all the way around my object all the way through. So that's something that would have been very difficult to texture map in Maya if you had to do that by hand or the old-fashioned way. So there's lots more to talk about on the UV front, but we don't have time to talk about it, so I'm going to move on and talk about a couple of different things. These are some of the other things that I've mentioned along the way. One thing that's new is color management. I'll talk about that in a little bit when we get into rendering and lighting, but that is new in the UV editor. So let's move on. These are all the brushes. Let's talk about Xgen. So Xgen is something you often would think of as a effects tool. What we think of as effects tend to be more dynamics, so things that are moving. So for instance, in particles, in cloth, things like Bifrost are what we categorize as effects. Xgen is all about object creation, so it's about generating objects or generating assets. So for instance, things like hair, things like fur, you can also use it for geometry instancing, things like trees and bushes and leaves. So it's been around for several releases. In this release, we've done a lot of work on improving the interaction with guide curves. We've also added a preset option so that you can really quickly and easily generate a default effect, much like the old Fur toolkit. And then we've also done some work under the hood. For instance, we added multi-threading so that now when you render or you generate your Xgen instances, that process is multi-threaded, making it much faster and much more interactive. So we've made a lot of different improvements. I'm going to show you some of those in action. So let's go to Maya here and we'll open up a file. And I'll show you a character that you may have seen in various other demos. This is a character we call Bob. I'm not quite sure why his name is Bob, but that's his name. But Bob here has a nice head of hair, but it's very sparse. What these are guide curves. So these guide curves basically allow you to control the look and the flow of his underlying hair. If I go into the modeling menu set, Xgen has actually been moved into this menu set under Generate. So we have two things. We have the Xgen Editor, and we have the Xgen Library. So I'm going to go into the Xgen Editor, and we'll take a look at Bob's hair. And what you can see here is if I were to render this out, well, that's actually not his hair, that's his eyebrows. So that's an example of short hair. That's not what I want to show. I actually want to switch over into his hair. And I'll render that out. What you'll see is I get what I call the Ken doll effect. I don't know if you have Ken dolls in Brazil, but it's the companion to Barbie, which doesn't look very realistic. So we also have the ability to go in and add these things called modifiers. Modifiers allow you to go in and add things like clumping. Clumping allows you to control the distribution of the instance hairs. You can see that I actually have thousands and thousands of hairs in here, and those are basically interpolated between the guide curves. So this is a linear even interpolation, but effectively your end. I think it's actually not. There we go. And so you can basically add different levels of clumping. You can add things like noise. You can add things like cutting effects so that you can add different links along the clumps. And pretty quickly you can start to get this very realistic looking hair. So what I'm going to do now is start to change the look of his hair by changing the guide curve. So we'll turn off the instances, and we've made a number of improvements to the way that you work with hair. It used to be difficult to change the shape of guides, for instance. Now I can actually go in and I can just quickly select all my guides. Let's actually just switch this back. Select a bunch of guides. Right-click on guides, go to Control Points, and now I can grab an individual point, and you can see if I pull that individual point, it's only going to affect that point. If I hit the B hotkey, that's going to enable Soft Select, and now Soft Select will work with those guides. I can do these interesting things like rotation and scaling. That's a little bit much, but let's say I wanted his hair to look a little bit windblown there. I can apply a little translation, a little rotation, and now you can see the influence of that on the underlying hair. So you can work with Soft Select with guide curves now, which again is new, but you can also work in more of a sculptural manner. So similar to what I was showing before with sculpting geometry, I can actually go in and sculpt directly onto guide curves. So if you take a look at the Xgen menu set at the very end here, or rather the shelf, you can see here I've got a brush called Sculpt Guides. And what it allows me to do is exactly that. It allows me to create a brush with a radius and a fall off and then basically paint directly onto these guide curves. So for instance, if I wanted to kind of pull his hair off to the side and change the flow of his bangs, I can actually interactively go in and do that. I have to be a little bit careful about the direction that I'm painting. But you get the basic idea. I can start to change the flow of these various hairs. And now when I re-render that, again, with multi-threading, now you can see that I get a much different look. So it's much easier to change guide curves, much easier to manipulate guide curves, giving you more artistic control over the end result of your hair. But another thing that's really cool in 2016 is the ability to save presets for the hair or the short hair or long hair that you create. So if you go to the Xgen library, what you'll see is I've got a couple of different things here. I've got a default path, which is basically the built-in presets that we provide. So let's say, for instance, I bring up another character here. We'll use the character that I was using before, and that is my Sven character. So Sven has his very rigid, kind of hard geometric hair. I may want to use that or I may not. Let's just hide that. And let's instead just grab a piece of geometry that defines the scalp of my character. And let's say, for instance, I wanted to give him some short hair. I don't really know what I would want to use. Let's say I wanted to use, doesn't really matter. I have a different one each time. Let's choose bear just for fun. So if I import bear, import that onto my character, that'll automatically create the description for the bear hair effect. And now if I come and look in here, I have a new one called just description 7, a generic name. But if I render that out, what you'll see is I get this very short, kind of patchy bear hair. So that doesn't look very good, obviously, but that's just a simple example. I could apply in one of these default generic effects to get kind of a starting point for the look and feel that I'm going for. Let's actually delete this one. It doesn't look right. What I can do instead is I can take the definition from Bob, the one that I worked so hard to create this kind of nice looking hairdo, and I can export that. So if you go to File, you can say Export as Preset. And that will save that out as its own separate preset, which you can then load directly from the Xgen library. So instead of going to the default location, I've just created a link to my own project. And I forgot to save the icon, unfortunately, but you can also embed an icon. Now if I grab this, this scalp and I apply what I call Bob's head hair, and we'll import that and we'll call this Sven Transplant. So we'll import that. Now what that will do is it will take all of those guide curves and it will just transplant them directly onto my new character. They're a little bit different in size and shape. That's just a parameter that doesn't save with the preset. But if I go in and add a little bit of width to this and I go in and I add a little bit of taper, you can get basically the same look from a guide standpoint. So what you can see is if you look curve by curve, hair by hair, the curves and the guides that were on Bob have now been very nicely kind of recreated and then in a relative sense kind of transplanted onto my new character. So now to actually see what it looks like, let's go into my Xgen editor here and we'll go in and we'll start to render this out. So let's actually go into Sven Transplant. We'll render that and you can see what I get is the original look, which is basically I actually have to, I've got a simple little shader setting here that I had to turn on. But I get the kind of Ken doll look that I had before. I can also grab all of the guides and I can go in and I can kind of scale those down if my hair doesn't quite look right in order to get the right scale. It inherits all the modifiers. So the same clump modifiers that I had before and the same noise cut modifiers that I had before are now applied to Sven as well. So if I actually take a look at both of these, let's actually bring Bob back up and we'll put them side by side in a quick comparison. So if I grab Bob and I render him out, and then if I go in and turn off all my guides, and let's switch back over to Sven and I'll turn off his guides. Now you can see that I get a very, very similar look. It's a little different in terms of density, which I can go in and change, but in general, the overall look is going to be the same. This really, actually, when you turn on lighting, this is going to take a little bit of time to draw with the screen sharing, but when you turn on lighting and shadowing, you can get a much nicer kind of representation of what the hair is going to look like. So you get the basic idea. It gives you a starting point. It's not going to be 100% one-to-one the same, but it's going to be very similar, at least in terms of being a good starting point. So let's move on from Xgen, and we'll talk about some other stuff. There's still plenty to talk about. We'll get into rigging animation now. So rigging animation has one very, very important update or improvement that I'm going to talk about in a bit, but we're going to start with some rigging changes. So rigging incorporates or rather includes things like skeleton creation, things like skinning, things like constraints for building the interaction of your character. So we've added a few new things. One is something called the Delta Mush Deformer, and one is something called the Blend Shape Editor. So the Blend Shape Editor, basically, well, I can show you both of these, is the ability, or the Delta Mush Deformer is the ability to add a secondary control. I can actually find my file. Secondary control for a skin on your character that gives you a kind of an automated skinning effect. So let's give this scene a chance to look. What you'll notice as soon as this comes in is that my character, or rather my scene, automatically loads even the textures were deferred in the background. That's just a setting. So I'm able to interact with my scene right away. But what you can see is I have a skeleton and I have no relationship between the skeleton and my skin. So this is actually taking a little while to update. So I'll give that a second. So what I want to do is create a relationship between these. So I'll grab the various parts pieces of my character, and then I'll shift select the skeleton, and I'll go in and I'll create a skin. So what we did is we added, whoops, oh, I'm in the wrong menu set, sorry about that, is we added a new option called dual quaternion skinning in 2015. If I were to do a classic distance-based skinning, I'm going to get something like this, which is not a very good look because one part of the body is affecting the other part, and I'm getting kind of really ugly default skinning, which would require a lot of manual effort to fix. So I'll undo that, and this time I'll rerun this with, instead of closest distance, geodesic voxel skinning. So now I'm going to rebind using geodesic voxel, which is an automated algorithm that basically will voxelize all the parts and pieces of your character, all the meshes, into one structure, and then do what's called a geodesic measurement within that structure to figure out how the joints should associate with the various pieces of geometry. So if I put my character back into the pose, what you can see is by default I get a much better skin. So it eliminates the problems that I had before where one body part was affecting the other. But it's still not perfect. If you actually take a look, you can see there's some areas like the hips here that aren't quite having the right effect or influence that I want. So this is a case where I can add a secondary effect called Delta Mush. If I undo this step and go back to before that pose, if I grab, say for instance, this piece of geometry, this piece of geometry, these three, and then under Deform, I apply something called Delta Mush, and then put this back into the pose. What you can see is that starts to improve those problem areas, like for instance, again, the hip. If I now grab this and I go into the Delta Mush settings, it's just a node that actually gets applied downstream or after the skin, and I can actually change this. I can increase, decrease the smoothing iterations as I need to. So you can see as I increase the smoothing iterations, it's giving me a better result. And then I've also got a smooth step option, which I can increase to get even better results. What you can actually see if I turn off called the displacement is I get this smooth effect. So what happens is it smooths mesh, calculates the deltas, and then applies those deltas back to the skinned version of the mesh, and then adds that displacement in order to correct the volume loss. But at any rate, what you end up with is much nicer skinning in certain parts. The problem is it's not perfect everywhere, so it ends up with these areas where the knee doesn't quite work. So here I can actually go in and I can skin these individual parts. So I can go into, for instance, Delta Mush, or rather paint these parts. I can go into Delta Mush, if I can find my paint settings here, and I can paint out certain areas. So if I hold down Control, I can remove the area of influence here for the Delta Mush and then blend it back in with the default skin weights, or rather the Delta Mush skin weights. So the Delta Mush happens here, the regular skinning happened here. So we've also improved, I'm a little bit short on time, but I think we can run a little bit over. We've also improved the blend shape interface. So blend shapes traditionally required that you needed multiple targets in order to create blend shapes, and you needed those targets to be separate objects. Now, if I go under Animation Editors into the blend shape editor, I can actually go in and create blend shapes directly from this interface, and then without having to manually create targets, I can add targets as deltas to my default, or rather my source mesh. So now what I get is multiple targets which I can then start to modify. So say for instance I wanted to edit this target, I go into edit mode, and now I can use things like my symmetrical modeling and things like soft select, go in here and add, for instance, a nice little fall off here, or a nice little kind of, whoops, let me turn off my slide. Maya is actually thinking. Well, let's gotta undo that. I still have a slide on, so it was trying to constrain to the surface, so I have to undo that, and then I'll turn off my slide. Now let's try this one more time. So there we go. I can go in and I can add something like an offset here. Let me change my soft select mode to surface. We'll pull that out, maybe scale this. Something like this. And now what you can see is that now gets applied as the blend shape. So you can also use your sculpting tools with this. So now I could basically go in and do sculpting edits on the additional blend shape, and then I can keep adding more and more blend shapes and just go into edit mode anytime I need to make a change on one of those blend shapes without having to actually create the separate objects. These just get stored as deltas. For time's sake, I'm going to move on because I have a couple more things that I want to show before we wrap up. So let's go back into the PowerPoint, and I just want to talk about one of the most important features in Maya 2016, and that is the performance improvements for animation. So what we've done in 2016 is we've essentially made animation, playback, and interaction multi-threaded, which means you could take advantage of multiple cores, as many cores as you need to, or as you have rather, when you're playing your animation. We've also added the ability to offload parts of your characters to the GPU, for instance, things like blend shapes, things like skins, and so on. And this works again with rig playback and manipulation. The way this works basically is that Maya's dependency graph gets converted into what's called a forward graph. We still have to maintain the dependency graph because the dependency graph is essentially the core of Maya, the guts of Maya. We couldn't change that because many people rely on it, many people have written tools around it, but it wasn't multi-threaded, it wasn't threadable, it wasn't parallel friendly. So under the hood, behind the scenes, we convert the dependency graph into what we call the forward graph, and then it gets managed by what we call the scheduler. And the scheduler chooses or determines which pieces of your graph can be sent to which cores on your system. And we also have the ability to create evaluators that allow you to offload things like the skins and things like the blend shapes. So we support most of the standard deformers in Maya, again, things like clusters, things like blend shapes, things like soft mod nodes. Those can be now branched off to the CPU, but we also provide API, so if you have custom deformers, you can actually make those accessible to the scheduler, and the scheduler can then offload those. So just to show this in action, let's go into Maya, and we'll bring up a scene. Whoops, bring that back. Let's go back to Maya, and we'll bring up a scene here, and I'll show the performance improvements. So I'm going to bring up a scene that has a character that you may have seen before. We'll give this a second to load. You'll notice the deferred texture loading there, which is nice. But what I have here is a character called the Juggernaut. This lives in the world of Sven that you saw before. And I've got a new bonus tool that will allow you to, let me just turn on the display of my frame rate. Turn on my frame rate. You can see the frame rate down here in the bottom. I've also got the ability to turn on what's called a floating frame rate. If you go to bonus tools under display, there's my floating frame rate, which you turn on and off. Actually, I just turned it off by mistake. And now you can actually get that frame rate directly in your viewport, and it becomes a node that you can actually move around and position within your scene so that you can clearly see what frame rate you're getting relative to a given character. So what you see here is if I push play, I'm getting a reasonable frame rate, but I'm actually not getting the full animation playback that I need to for this character. So if this were a game character, for instance, I may need to see this character at least 60 frames per second, and I can't do that right now. Right now I'm seeing about 19, 20 frames per second. So in order to see this at a full frame, 60 frames per second, I would have to do something like a play blast or a render to actually play that back. What you can see in the lower right is I have a heads-up display that's showing me right now that the evaluation of this character is happening using the dependency graph. The DG represents dependency graph. So if I go into the preferences, I have an option now, I'll pull this off to the side, of switching into different evaluation modes. So if I go to my animation settings for performance, I have evaluation. By default, that's set to DG. If I switch this from DG to parallel, as soon as I do that, you'll notice my frame rate almost doubles. It goes up to about 30 frames per second because now various parts and pieces of my character are threaded out to all the different cores that I have on my machine. If I actually bring up my task manager, I give that a second to play back, what you can see is that each one of these processors is basically maxing out. I'm using 80 some odd, 85% of all of cores on my entire machine to play back that animation. Previously, Maya would only use 1 or 2 threads depending on what you were doing. Now it's using every single thread, every single core on my machine. In addition to that, I can now take advantage of the graphics card as well by turning on what's called GPU override. which basically offloads anything that can be sent to the GPU, so that now things like the scan or things like blend shapes are being laid on the GPU itself. Now, I'm seeing about 40 to 50 frames per second here. That's because of the lag with the web sharing. If I were not sharing this over the web, this would be over 6 frames per second. So it's a little bit misleading right now because of the screen sharing. But it's a big improvement, and again, this applies to manipulation of the rig as well. So the interactivity and posing of the rig is going to be much faster as a result of both the parallel evaluation and the GPU override. So again, if I turn that off and switch back into DG, you can see he immediately slows way down. So that's a big improvement. It doesn't take very long to show, but it's a very important improvement, and it was very big undertaking, needless to say, because it's really essentially re-architecting the way Maya works under the hood. So it's a pretty profound change. But for the most part, it's not even obvious to the user necessarily. Once you turn it on, it's just on. So we also provide something called a performance profiler. If we go under our general editors, we have something called Performance Profiler. This is a way to diagnose your scene. So if I were to go into the Performance Profiler, and actually I turned off my settings. Let me just turn those back on real quick. Let's just turn back on Parallel and GPU. If I were to play this back and go to the Performance Profiler and say record my scene, what that's going to do is it's going to show you exactly how your scene is being evaluated. So you can see here that all of my evaluation is happening in this bar right here, but you can actually break this down into different views. For instance, if I put this into a threaded view, you can see that I get this nice even distribution of all the various nodes within my scene across all of the different cores of the scene as well, or rather of my system. So there's a lot more information online about how to use the Performance Profiler. This is a very short introduction, but from a technical animator standpoint, anybody who's building animation rigs, this is a really nice interface for evaluating the performance of the rig so that you can fine-tune them to make them as fast as possible. So we're going to run through, We're going to run through just a few more things, and then we'll finish off with Bifrost improvements. There's been some nice small improvements to the animation workflow. I'm not going to go over all these in detail, but these are basically just simple kind of day-to-day improvements that will improve your interactivity and improve your iteration times when you're dealing with animation. So finishing off with lighting and rendering, and then we'll talk about effects. Lighting and rendering, there are two main things that have been done. One is color space management. Color space management allows you to control the color space of anything in Maya that involves color. That includes things like the viewport, it includes the render view, it includes the UV editor, it includes the color picker, color swatches, shader balls, and so on. So just to show you a really quick example, if I were to bring that scene that I showed before with the UV editor, sometimes when you're dealing with textures, you may need to adjust the gamma of your textures. You may need to work in a linear color space. You may want to de-gamma your images, or you may want to add a consistent gamma to your images, or you may want to do something like add a tone map. Say, for instance, you're doing some compositing downstream. If I grab this object here, and I come in and actually just show the texture, what you can see is that depending on what I select, I'm going to get different views in my UV editor. And sometimes I might want to actually change the representation of this. So I might want to switch this to, for instance, a raw color format. If I do that in the viewport, you'll notice that UV editor no longer matches because the UV editor is still using sRGB gamma. I can switch that over into raw as well, and I'll see the same color representation in my UV editor. Likewise, if I wanted to apply something like a tone map, I could apply a blue tone map, or I could apply a sepia tone map, or whatever it may be. I can see the same exact color correction in the UV editor that I'm seeing in the viewport. That applies again to all the various editors as well, things like Play Blast, things like the render view, and so on. So another big improvement is the Hypershade Editor. The Hypershade Editor has been redesigned to be much more modular and much more flexible, but we've also added some nice new features as well. We've integrated the Node Editor, so the Node Editor is directly in the Hypershade. It used to be a separate interface. We've added the ability to custom shader balls. ability to integrate a viewport directly into the Hypershade. So the Hypershade now becomes what we call the Look Dev Editor, and it's essentially a separate, almost standalone UI for editing your shader networks and editing the look of your scene. You can also do things like solo outputs, so if you wanted to see only the normal map or only the specular map without the interference of the other textures, you can just click on the little S. It will filter the viewport and it will filter the ball to represent only that particular node. So finishing off, we'll show a couple of things with effects. A little bit over time, but I think I can wrap this up in a couple of minutes. The big thing with effects is the continued integration of Bifrost. We've added a bunch of new stuff with Bifrost, and I don't have time to go over everything, but there's lots of information online already. One of my coworkers, Daryl O'Bear, has posted a number of in-depth movies and tutorials on the area. So if you want to get more information about all the changes that we made to Bifrost, you go to the area. It's autodesk.area.com, I believe, or just search for Autodesk Area and look for Daryl's blogs and or blog posts. And he goes into a lot of detail about this. I'm going to show one simple example. The things we've updated are adaptive simulation, the ability to control simulation of things like foam so that it only solves in the area of the camera frustum. Guided simulation, where you can actually use geometry caches to control the look and feel of a water simulation. We've added whitewater, which is a foam effect, a secondary dynamic effect on top of the liquid simulation. We've added viscosity and surface tension, which gives you a thicker liquid control. So instead of just water, you can have things like milk or lava or things like goo. Aero is an atmospheric effect. You see here in the upper right where you can create things like smoke and steam and fog, again, atmospheric effects. So it's no longer just about water. Bifrost initially, when it came out, was only about water. Now it's expanded to a lot of different areas. And we've also introduced kind of the first iteration of a node graph interface for Bifrost. So this is available now to experiment with. It basically shows you the nodes and the connections that basically create the underlying effect. So you can break connections to fine-tune the effect. But again, this is kind of a first iteration. There'll be more to come on this. So I want to show you one quick example of one of the new effects, and that is for creating foam simulation for water. So I'm going to show a movie here, and I don't know if it's going to play back very well, but this was by a customer in France called Cube Creative, and we're just going to see how this plays back. I may have to just stop on a few frames, but this is called a movie called 5 meters 80, and it's basically a bunch of giraffes that have been animated, and then actually this isn't playing back very well, but the end result is that these giraffes all kind of marching towards what is going to be a pool. Actually, I'll just pause on individual frames. But you can see here that the giraffes are running up the end of the platform. There's a giraffe there hanging on a swing to catch them. They run up, they jump into the air, and this is the part where the actual liquid happens. Sorry, I got to go back a little bit. He catches them, swings them around, and then they splash to the water. So right about there, you're going to see the giraffe fall to the water, and right about here, you're going to see that splashing effect. So this doesn't show very well on still frames, but you can see the splashing effect there. So this was all done with, I believe originally with Naiad. Naiad was the predecessor to Bifrost. So Bifrost now being integrated directly in Maya, these same kinds of effects can be created directly in Maya. So I'll show you this same example. I'll show it interactively in Maya. So we'll go to Maya, and we'll open up a scene here. And this will be the last thing I show before we wrap up. I've lost my project there. There it is. And so the idea here is that I have a piece of geometry which is an animated character, and I want it to splash into a pool of water. So if I were to come in here and play this back, what you'll see if I push play is the giraffe kind of floating down and through what looks like just a solid piece of geometry. What's actually happening here is this piece of geometry is a volume that is creating a liquid object. So if I take this geometry and I go into my FX menu, under Bifrost, I can convert this into a liquid object. And by doing that, I'll end up with something that looks, whoops, let's try to hide that piece of geometry there. Something that looks like this, which is a liquid object. And if I go back to first frame, what I see is it just creates this massive field of particles that fall within that volume. The next step would be to take that field of particles, shift select my giraffe, shift select the boundary, and then I can go in using Bifrost and I can add those as collision objects. Now, as soon as I do that and push play, Bifrost starts to solve. I've actually done this in advance so it can solve in the background. But you can see now that as I push through these frames, you can see the interaction of the character with the body of water. So the splash that you see here is part of the same solve, the same simulation, and I'm actually going to go in and turn off background processing just so I get better performance. But what I want to actually create is a secondary effect that creates foam on top of this object. So I would simply select the volume of the Bifrost, or the container of the Bifrost, and on the Bifrost menu I have a new foam option. I apply the foam and I get indeed a secondary effect. So you can see now I get two effects. I get the original Bifrost solve, and then I get the foam solve on top of that happens again as a secondary effect. If I isolate that, you can actually see what that looks like. This is the foam itself isolated, and it happens both on the top of the water as foam and within the body of the water as bubbles. So in order to actually view this in higher detail, this is just a viewport representation. I would actually have to render this out. So I have a rendered example here which actually just shows you, oh, that's the wrong one, which actually just shows you the rendered version of the splash. Oops, let's turn that off. Let's bring this back. There we go. So this is actually a rendered version of that same splash. And you can see the various foam effects as they start to leave the base body of particles that is the original Bifrost solve, and secondary solve essentially almost composited on top of that in 3D. So that's just one of the new features in for Bifrost in Maya 2016, but I'm over time, so I'm going to end the webinar now. I'm going to hand it back to Rodrigo now for questions.
Thank you very much, Steven. Agora vamos para a sessão de perguntas e respostas. Uma das primeiras perguntas que eu recebi aqui foi com relação ao plano de aluguel da Autodesk. Se a gente tem planos para fazer um aluguel mensal, como foi mencionado aqui no site da Autodesk dos Estados Unidos. Sim, você pode alugar por mês. Nós temos os planos trimestrais, semestrais e anuais aqui no Brasil. E a gente tem plano, sim, de adotar esse modelo que é você alugar pelo site por mês. Ainda não está disponível para alugar por mês, mas o plano sim é trazer esse tipo de aluguel aqui para o Brasil também de um mês, tá? Essa foi a primeira pergunta. A segunda pergunta que a gente recebeu aqui também foi uma pergunta sobre quais são as vantagens do Maya 2016 com relação ao 3D Studio Max 2016. Eu acredito que as vantagens são em relação a Bifrost, né? A gente tem um simulador de líquidos e hoje a gente tem um simulador de fumaça dentro do Maya que a gente não tem nativamente no Max. A gente teria que ou fazer com Particle Flow, ou a gente teria que ter algum outro plugin para poder atingir isso. Essa é uma vantagem que eu acredito que o Maya tem em relação ao Max. Porém, a modelagem do Max ela é uma modelagem que muitas features novas do Maya que vocês viram agora com o Steve Roselle são features que já existiam no Max, na modelagem. Então, o Max ele sempre foi um pouco mais robusto na parte de modelagem, coisa que o Maya agora correu atrás e incorporou dentro do seu software, né? Uma vantagem que os dois têm, acredito hoje, que o Maya e o Max estão buscando multithreading. Estão reformulando ferramentas para trazer a GPU também. Você faz um investimento muito alto dentro de uma placa gráfica, né, na sua estação de trabalho, e você precisa, né, o software precisa usar essa GPU. Então, hoje a Autodesk está fazendo muito investimento para trazer as ferramentas dentro da GPU e usar o máximo cores possível, tá? Então, eu acredito que os dois estão fazendo isso com muita capacidade. E uma vantagem que eu gostei do Maya em relação ao Max esse ano foi realmente trabalhar com UVs e brushes. Você trabalha com a UV de uma maneira super interativa, como se você estivesse pintando. E a nova shelf com as ferramentas de modelagem também, eu acredito que foi uma vantagem que a gente trouxe do Mudbox e incorporou no Maya. Mas de resto, eu vou fazer no dia 16 de julho, para a informação de vocês. No dia 16 de julho, às 11 horas da manhã, vou fazer um webinar falando também sobre o Maya em português. Vou falar também sobre as novidades do 3D Studio Max. Espero que vocês possam também atender a esse webinar. Essa gravação do webinar que o Steven Roselle fez hoje vai estar disponível, tá, online. Depois a gente vai mandar um e-mail para você com a gravação e aí vocês vão poder assistir quantas vezes vocês quiserem, ok? E para finalizar também, tinha uma outra pergunta que é sobre se existem planos para fazer o Maya menos destrutivo na parte de modelagem, como é feito no Max. O Max trabalha com modificadores, a gente pode trabalhar com diversos modificadores, refazer a modelagem e ele não traz a base mesh. Essa é uma pergunta que eu vou fazer ao Steve, porque eu realmente não sei responder se está tendo planos ou não para que isso seja feito. E eu acredito que também o Maya não é tão destrutivo assim. Steven, people are asking if is there any plans to make Maya less destructive on the modeling side? Comparing 3ds Max, for example, 3ds Max uses modifier stack, so you can have like lots of layers doing the mesh modifying. I believe it's not that destructive modeling using Maya because you can, yeah, just I'm gonna hold on.
Yeah, the way that Max's stack works and the way that Maya dependency graph works are similar, but obviously very, very different at the same time. So Maya will never be one-to-one the same as Max in terms of how the modeling works, you know, at a lower level with the stack. But we are definitely looking at ways, you know, to improve kind of the non-destructive aspects. You know, Maya can be non-destructive in some ways, but yeah, it can be destructive in others. So the short answer is yes, we're always looking for ways to improve that. But you know, specifically, you know, what we're going to be doing, I can't really talk about beyond what's in the current release now.
Thank you, Steven. Então, acredito que é isso, gente. Muito obrigado pela presença de todo mundo. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Foi a primeira vez que eu tive a ideia de trazer um especialista técnico da Autodesk dos Estados Unidos. Se vocês gostarem mesmo, a gente vai poder repetir, refazer outros webinars para Max, para Motion Builder, Mudbox. E espero que vocês realmente tenham gostado. A gente vai encerrar por aqui. Depois a gente vai passar os links para vocês. E só gostaria de, por último, falar que a gente vai estar no BIG, que é o Brasil International Game Festival. Hoje, às 2 horas, Steve Roselle vai estar lá também palestrando sobre o Maya, focado para games. Eu vou estar lá também falando do 3D Studio Max 2016 com as novas ferramentas. Vamos estar lá até às 4, 5 horas da tarde no Centro Cultural São Paulo, no Metrô Vergueiro. Sexta-feira também iremos ao BIG, que é o Brasil International Game Festival. Na 1h45 teremos um keynote, falar assuntos mais high-end, mais high-levels, não tão demos, como a demo técnica vai ser hoje. Sexta-feira a gente vai falar da nossa visão de futuro da Autodesk. No dia 16 de julho, eu vou fazer a webinar, né, aqui também, online, para vocês, falando sobre a suíte de entretenimento 2016, Max e Maya, as novidades em português, tá bom? E o AU Brasil também, não esquecendo, teremos um dia de AU Brasil com 5 sessões de M&E, cuidados internacionais, convidados nacionais, são 5 palestras de mídia e entretenimento, não percam, dia 3 de setembro, procurem o site do AU Brasil no Google e vocês vão entrar e vão poder se cadastrarem lá e registrarem no evento. Bom, é isso, muito obrigado mesmo para a presença de todos, gostaria de agradecer a presença do Steven Roselle, que está aqui no Brasil, nos prestigiando, e thank you very much, Steven, for your presence here in Brazil. I think everybody enjoyed your webinar, it was really great, we're really glad you're here. And thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.